In 1989, a software engineer by the name of Jay Geertsen was studying the X11 windowing system when he decided to cobble together a simple game as a way to practice what he'd learned. Using the universal game of tic-tac-toe as a foundation, and taking a little inspiration from the recent smash hit Tetris, he would wind up creating the first version of the game we know as Columns. The rules were simple. The titular columns, composed of 3 squares, would slowly fall from the top of the screen, and the player would rearrange them in such a way that squares of the same color from adjacent columns would line up, clearing them from the board. Any squares above the cleared set would drop, and the process would continue so long as chains of 3 identically colored squares kept being formed. The game was released as shareware on DOS and Mac, where it eventually caught the eye of the Japanese developer Sega. Sega had released its own version of Tetris in arcades, but had since lost the license to continue making Tetris games. They needed something with which to fill the gap, and Columns was just the ticket. Sega bought the rights to the game, turning those boring old squares into brilliant gems.
They're jewels, Betty. They're jewels.
And released their own version in Japanese arcades in March of 1990, where it became Tetris's biggest rival, at least at the time. The Mega Drive port of the game would go on to be one of the system's all-time biggest sellers in Japan, cementing its status as a core Sega IP for years to come. Fast forward to 1997. Sakura Wars had just been released the year prior to great acclaim and sales, and Sega was looking to capitalize on its newfound success. According to an interview in Saturn Fan magazine, the developers were looking to broaden the appeal of the Sakura Wars cast by putting them in other genres of games. Columns was a series with long-standing appeal of its own, so combining the two made sense. Two great tastes that go great together, as it were. Come March 28th, barely 6 months after the release of the original Sakura Wars, Sega pumped out Hanagumi Taisen Columns, perhaps better known to English speakers as Sakura Wars Columns, or is it Columns Sakura Wars, onto the Saturn, with an arcade port to follow later that year. To be perfectly honest, I was never that big into Columns before. The aesthetic of the first game seemed really plain to me, and this is coming from a guy who was obsessed with Greek antiquity back when he was a kid. Columns 3 was a step up in both style and music, but the gameplay still felt a little too stiff for my tastes. Too restrictive compared to the likes of Tetris or Puyo Puyo. Something was still missing. And it turns out that something was cute girls and super meters. Shit, at this point I'd probably eat a pile of broken glass if you told me there was a picture of Koran under it. But seriously though, the twists this game made to the Columns formula were exactly the hook I was looking for all these years. See, in your average game of Columns, clearing gems and forming combos creates a wall on the opponent's side of the screen, giving them less space to maneuver and making it easier for them to lose. However, in this version, clearing gems instead builds this meter here, and once the meter is full, you get a lips prompt with 3 options. Spend it on an attack super, spend it on a defensive super, or save it. The attack super fills your opponent's well with special gems that require several columns to be placed before they can be used, with the amount of time depending on your choice of character. If you've ever played a game like Puzzle Fighter, this should be a familiar concept to you. The defensive super takes away the bottommost rows of gems, with the amount of rows again determined by your character choice. This gives you more breathing room and, in some cases, can even save you from the brink of defeat. You can save up to 3 charges, with each charge increasing the effects of the super moves. The attack super will drop more gems, and the defensive super will erase more rows from the bottom. The charge option also gets replaced by a new option at level 3, the magic gem, which clears out all gems of the same color it touches. It's a nice alternative to the defensive super if you use it right, letting you clear space and start chain combos that will grant you even more meter, sometimes enough to follow it up immediately with another super if you so choose. It's an effective way to split the difference between offense and defense. At any rate, whenever you use a super, it'll clear out all your meter charges, starting you over from 0. As such, battles in this game require careful prioritization of seizing the right opportunities for attack, and knowing when to hold off and wait for your chance to land an even bigger attack. Plus, even when you get inundated with attack gems, smartly planning around them can present some great reversal opportunities, letting you turn a disastrous setback into a crushing victory. This system alone makes Columns far more compelling, but of course, that's only half the equation here, half the secret sauce that makes this game so good. What about all the Sakura Wars themed set dressing? Well, first, let's get this out of the way. There's no beating around the bush here. The game is pretty clearly a budget title. There's a ton of reused graphics and artwork from the first game, particularly in the story mode, and the intro cinematic consists entirely of still illustrations sliding across the screen. Intros like this weren't entirely uncommon for arcade-style games, but let's be real, this ain't no Street Fighter Alpha 2 intro. However, that's not to say this game is just a cobbled-together rush job. For all the reused artwork the game features, there's a bevy of new original art, and it's all simply delightful. There are so many great illustrations and downright powerful images that show up in the background alone. I couldn't even begin to fit them all here. I also really like the little chibi sprites of the two characters playing against each other, furiously mashing buttons on their little Saturn pads. Just look at them go! Also, if you have game clear save data from Sakura Wars 1, you can unlock different gem options based on all the characters whose endings you got. Oh right, that reminds me. There we go, moving on. While the music for the menus in the story mode are all reused as well, the music during the actual puzzle sequences are all these really neat remixes of each character's themes from the first game. I particularly like Koran's, irrespective of it being associated with her. It's a really cool, funky spin on her theme from the first game, with some late 80s, early 90s hip-hop flourishes. Aesthetics aside, the game modes themselves are also slathered in a coat of Sakura Wars paint. First, there's Cinderella mode, which is basically this game's traditional arcade ladder. The premise here is that the Flower Division are putting on a production of the titular play, but there's a twist. They're letting Ogami be a part of the play, and not just as any role, but as Prince Charming himself. This makes the girls go absolutely feral, and they decide to duel for the right to play Cinderella alongside them. The losers, meanwhile, are relegated to a variety of supporting roles such as Tree, Horse, and the Ugly Stepsisters. Thus, you pick a review member to play, each of them having different attack and defense stats for their supers, as mentioned earlier, and fight for Flower Division dominance. The fun doesn't stop once you've cleared them all out, however, as Yuri, Kasumi, and Tsubaki crash the party, acting as one single unit, followed by Ayame. Once they're down, it's time for the final boss, the last person standing between you and Ogami, Yoneda. Yeah, not only is he the final boss of the arcade ladder, but he's also this game's troll character. If that wasn't enough, to add further insult to injury, when he beats you, he gets the role of Prince Charming. He's pretty tricky too, but once you manage to beat him, you get your character's ending, consisting of full-screen still illustrations with a little bit of voiceover.
心配せんかって大丈夫。うちと大神藩やったら絶対うまくいくて。
Plus, the game gives you a code that unlocks Ayame, the Wind Division, and Yoneda for regular play. And yes, they all have their own endings too. All of them. Second, there's Puzzle Mode, where you go through pre-made boards and try to achieve specific goals, such as lower all the gems below the indicated line or destroy the highlighted gem. Nothing too fancy, but nonetheless engaging and occasionally devious. Finally, there's the Story Mode, where the true meat of this game lies. Here you follow Ogami as he makes his way through individual stories revolving around each playable character. They mostly involve having to face off against other characters in columns matches to settle disputes or to get them to agree to something. Don't ask me how that works in-universe. They all just say, I challenge you to a duel, and then bam, columns happens. Are they tossing gems at each other? Are they busting out anachronistic Saturns and playing the columns video game? Is it just a metaphor? Who knows? But yeah, as you could probably guess from that description, the stories here are strictly slice-of-life affairs. There's no clashes against the Black Hive or any major conflicts to speak of whatsoever. You just get to hang out with the squad in their downtime as they keep things lively with puzzle battles. This mode features the lip system in its more traditional form, but instead of your choices impacting your trust levels with other characters, they affect the parameters of the subsequent duels. Make good lips prompt choices and you'll start the duel with a higher super meter accrual rate, or, in the case of pre-made puzzles, extra time on the clock. Now, since the Columns games don't have an overarching narrative of any canonical importance, I'm going to forego the usual laboriously detailed summary. Instead, I'll just give you a little taste of what each character's story is about. Sakura wants to go to a fireworks show with Ogami, but as luck would have it, multiple characters need their help with various tasks. Sakura and Ogami must weasel their way out of their obligations if they're to make it to the show before it ends. Sumire and Ogami have been picked to represent the Flower Division as guides to a group of special guests, much to the dismay of everyone else on the team. They decide to settle who gets to be the representatives via a costume contest, which totally isn't just an excuse to recycle old character portraits. Maria asks Ogami if she can accompany him on his night watch. She's grown concerned about a recent trend of all the Flower Division members staying up way too late at night, and now it's up to the two of you to make the others go to bed. By force. Kana needs Ogami's help to track down an encyclopedia, specifically the volume on science and technology. This comes as a surprise to pretty much everyone, but when asked what she intends to do with this volume, her lips are sealed. Someone took Iris's cake, and she's pissed.
I want that cake!
She and Ogami work together to get some answers and track down the culprit. The truth may very well shock you. Kodan and Ogami decide to hit the town together, but when it turns out Ogami's flat broke, they decide to wander around the theater instead. They then get embroiled in what could basically be described as a Zelda-esque trading quest, suddenly acquiring random objects and just as quickly exchanging them with other people. That's not all though, as meeting certain criteria throughout these story modes also lets you unlock the stories for Ayame, the Wind Division, and Yoneda. Ayame finds Ogami cleaning his quarters in preparation for the new year, and together they go around the theater, helping everybody with their New Year's prep. A touch I appreciate in this story is the inclusion of some light foreshadowing of the events of Chapter 8 in the main game, which actually helps the game feel more grounded in the series canon, despite all this. The Wind Division trio want to go out on the town with Ogami, but need to find people willing to fill in for them for various chores around the theater. This too, naturally, is accomplished by puzzle-based coercion. Finally, Yoneda wants to put on a one-man rokyoku show for everyone at the theater. Rokyoku is a genre of traditional Japanese music that was particularly popular in the Meiji and Taisho eras. It typically features a singer reciting a story while accompanied by a shamisen player, usually with a jazz-like improvisational element. Yoneda's skills, however, leave much to be desired. As such, Yoneda enlists Ogami's help in convincing all the others to attend. The stories here are a lot of fun, the exact brand of lighthearted fare that I love from this series, and they round out the package wonderfully. Even if you can't understand Japanese though, I'd recommend picking this up if you own a Saturn. You might not be able to play the story mode, but the other modes are very much playable so long as you have a basic menu translation guide at your fingertips. The core mechanics are strong enough to overcome the language barrier, and as such, it's an easy recommendation for any puzzle fan. Hanagumi Taisen Columns was met with a warm reception and sales success, selling over 50,000 copies during its release weekend, a strong launch for a game in Japan, particularly at the time. Even though it was just a spin-off, it did leave its own little mark on the mainline series. In Sakura Wars 2, once Iris gets the Tembu, her normal attacks have her materializing gems and throwing them at her opponents. If you look closely, you can see that they're all gems from Columns, a cute homage to a well-loved offshoot, cementing its place as a part of the series' overall identity. The game was ultimately successful enough to warrant a proper sequel. Released for the Dreamcast on January 6, 2000, Hanagumi Taisen Columns 2 was the very first Sakura Wars game released for the system, 4 months before the Dreamcast port of Sakura Wars 1. It also served as the opening salvo of the year-long
Sakura Project 2000.
A huge marketing initiative that, in addition to the release of the Dreamcast ports of the first two games, saw the release of tie-in media such as the Sakura Wars TV anime and Sakura Wars GB, as well as the announcement of the theatrical feature film and the reveal of Sakura Wars 3. Think of it as a less disastrous precursor to Nintendo's Year of Luigi. But I digress. While being similar in concept to the first Columns spin-off, albeit based on Sakura Wars 2 rather than Sakura Wars 1, Columns 2 is a whole world apart in terms of scope and gameplay modes. Perhaps most importantly to anyone watching this video though, this one is playable in English, thanks to a fan translation patch released in late April 2021. I'll be playing the fan translation for this video because, 1, playing fan translations is much less of a pain in the ass on an actual Dreamcast than it is on an actual Saturn, and 2, I retranslated Sakura Wars 1 primarily as a test to see if doing these videos would be feasible for me in the first place. And after over 4 hours of independently translated video content thus far, and all the additional editing work that entails, I think I could use a breather. The fan translation comes with its own unique quirks and perks not found in the original Japanese version, but I'll address those where appropriate. So, what exactly is new in 2, you may be asking? For starters, the game has significantly more characters, 12 compared to the first game's 9. There are technically 4 new characters, but one of them, Kaede, is an exact clone of Ayame's gameplay style from the first game. Try to act surprised. The other 3 are Orihime and Reni, naturally, as well as my dude Kayama as a boss character you can unlock later. But of course, more characters doesn't necessarily merit a whole sequel on its own, no. You need some system changes to go along with it. That's why this game introduces the Captain Command system from Sakura Wars 2, retooled to fit a puzzle game context. If you remember what those entailed, you can probably guess how they apply here. Forest Mode is the neutral default, an experience identical to the first game's gameplay. Fire Mode charges up the meter more slowly, but grants you access to a level 4 offensive super. The trade-off for this, however, is that you stop being able to use defensive supers past level 2, so tread with caution. Wind Mode charges the super meter faster, but limits you to level 2 supers at maximum. Mountain Mode charges the meter the slowest of all modes, but skips the level 1 charge entirely, starting you off at level 2 at the bare minimum. Of course, these are only the commands you start with. Another thing this game has over its predecessor is a bevy of unlockable content, as presented via this extras menu that fills up as you progress. Among this veritable content mountain are 2 additional captain commands, Shadow and Thunder. Both of these commands are more extreme versions of the pre-existing commands. Shadow Mode limits you to only 1 meter charge, but that 1 charge brings you right up to level 3, and on the whole is faster than charging your super from 0 to 3 in the other modes. As good as that sounds though, this means you're sacrificing the ability to use smaller supers at a more regular clip, so you might not be able to take advantage of fleeting openings in the opponent's defense, and your own defense becomes a lot trickier to manage. Thunder Mode, on the other hand, is like Fire Mode on steroids. You get access to a level 4 offensive super, and it charges even faster than in Fire Mode, but as a trade-off, you have no defensive supers whatsoever. As great as all these additions are though, there are 2 tweaks this game makes that kinda bug me. 1, the gem clearing and chain animations are so slow. And 2, it takes way too long for your drop pieces to lock into place. In Hanagumi Taisen Columns 1, clearing chains feels quick and snappy, plus your columns lock into place much more quickly. In Columns 2, the gem clearing animations and subsequent drops take significantly longer, and the game gives you more time before column placements are locked in. The latter tweak I imagine was made to make the game easier, but all it does is make it easier for me to screw up. Ultimately, I'm left in a spot where I prefer the feel of the first game while preferring the mechanical depth of the second. Another feature this game had upon its release was online functionality, but unfortunately, the service period for the online multiplayer was very short-lived, lasting only a little over a year and a half. The game also let you access the official homepage for news updates, gameplay tips, and free DLC puzzles. Though the site and its contents are all still live as of this recording, the fan translation actually includes a backup of both the site and all the DLC puzzles in the patch itself, preserving this little slice of Sakura Wars history if ever the original site does go down. Just keep in mind that, on earlier versions of this patch, accessing these requires a functioning modem and browser configuration settings on your Dreamcast system, even though you never actually connect to the internet to access the backup, as it's all stored in the patched game itself. This requirement has been hacked out as of version 1.2, so as long as you're up to date, you're golden. Accompanying all these system changes, though, are the aesthetic changes, and this part, unfortunately, is a bit of a mixed bag, so let's start with the positive part first. On the musical side, it's a step up from the last game on the whole. The remixes are of a much higher, more consistent quality. Sakura and Orihime's themes in particular are super catchy earworms. and Rennie's theme gives me the uncontrollable urge to go drift racing. My favorite theme, though, has to be Yoneda's, which is a very pleasant and mellow remix of the first Sakura Wars' battle theme. It just makes me feel all nice and cozy, which is kinda weird considering Yoneda is once again the troll character. Where the music excels, though, the illustrations are lacking. Barring the character portraits from Sakura Wars 2 that get reused in the story mode here, everyone just looks off most of the time. Whereas the first Columns game's art looked consistent with the original game's art and designs more often than not, everyone in Columns 2 looks off-model a lot of the time, in ways that aren't even consistent from image to image. I think my boy Kayama here gets it the worst out of any of them. His hair's meant to be slicked back with a few errant spikes sticking up, but here, dude just has straight-up hair antennas. Also, this one's a matter of taste more than anything, but I much prefer the style of art used for the chibi characters in Columns 1 than 2. I find them a lot more charming, whereas I find the ones in 2 more crudely drawn, cheaply animated, and just kinda creepy looking in general. Of course, this isn't to say there aren't any good illustrations in the game, but the visuals, on the whole, are weaker compared to the game's predecessor. It's a good thing, then, that this is the weakest aspect of the game, and it's all uphill from here. For single-player modes, we have Shonen Red vs. the Crimson Lizard as this game's arcade ladder to start with. The premise is similar to the last game's Cinderella mode, where the girls all compete for the leading role, only this time, they're fighting for the cowl of the masked hero Shonen Red, the same one from the radio dramas you could experience in Sakura Wars 2. The losers, again, are relegated to props and supporting roles. Following that, we have Director Mode, which is a separate bite-sized arcade ladder for boss characters, where they instead fight over who gets to direct the play, with the losers relegated to various custodial tasks. We also get Endless Mode and Puzzle Mode like before, and, as previously mentioned, there are a small handful of additional Puzzle Mode puzzles as DLC. Finally, Story Mode naturally makes its return, this time with a suite of new functions and features. First is the addition of some of the new lips types introduced in Sakura Wars 2. Timing lips, click lips, the gang's all here. What's more, while you still have to make the right choices to make your chosen character happy, which in turn makes the Columns duels and puzzles easier, you now have to take the feelings of your opponent into account as well. For instance, if you say something that upsets your opponent, their super meter charge rate will increase. But if you say something that flatters them or makes them happy, they'll go easier on you by lowering their supercharge rate. Also, in contrast to the first game, if you lose a match in story mode here, it'll get increasingly easier with the opponent's super meter charge rate whittling down with every retry. Whether this is a good or a bad thing is entirely up to your taste. It can be relieving to get past a rough roadblock thanks to this system, but at the same time, it kinda has the same feel as... Also, might as well address the elephant in the room here. You may have noticed none of the characters here are lip-synced like they usually are in the other games. Unfortunately, this is the result of a technical limitation with the fan translation patch, as the Japanese version does retain the lip sync we've all come to expect. I spoke with the patch's programmer, Derek Pascarella, and according to him, the story mode segments, despite looking very similar to Sakura Wars 2 on the surface, are completely different on a code level under the hood. Re-implementing the lip sync would cost about 75% of the memory space allocated for the translated text, which in turn would require creating custom tools just to claw back all the space needed. A gargantuan task, all told. It's a shame, but I think it's a price worth paying in order to get this game playable in English. Right then, enough about the mechanical minutia. What kind of wacky, nutty hijinks are we getting into this time?
血まみれで倒れてるんです。
Whereas the first game's story mode featured relatively low-key slice-of-life antics, the second game's story mode is, for the most part, pure Saturday morning cartoon shenanigans. Sakura is in a panic after discovering that she and Ogami rubbed their two collective brain cells together in order to uncover the truth and crack the case. Sumire has been struck with amnesia, and it's up to the gang to help her restore her memory. Or troll the shit out of her. Either or. Kodan's latest invention, a body-swapping machine, goes haywire, resulting in Kayama's mind being blasted into various other characters' bodies.
Yeah! Ogami!
It's up to Ogami and Kodan to track down Kayama's runaway brain and put that thing back where it came from. Kana decides to start fasting in order to settle a dispute with Sumire, causing concern among the other members of the Flower Division. This quickly turns into a competition of sorts to see who can get her to break her fast first. Maria asks Ogami if she can accompany him on his night watch. She's grown concerned about a recent trend of all the Flower Division members staying up way too late at night, and now... Wait, which game is this? Where am I?
Why do I smell burnt toast?
Jean-Paul has gone missing, and Iris is in distress. Ogami offers to help her, but everyone they ask about Jean-Paul acts extremely cagey and suspicious. This leads to serious trust issues from Iris.
Everybody betrayed me. I fed up with this world.
Orihime learns about the Japanese folktale The Straw Millionaire, in which an impoverished man, starting with just a single piece of straw, trades his way to an unimaginable fortune. However, Orihime misinterprets this as a formal Japanese custom, and uses it as a pretense to ruin everyone's day. Reni goes out to the yard to give the dog breakfast, but the little fella's nowhere to be found. Ogami helps her look for him, but they quickly discover that everyone has their own name for the dog. Reni decides to make a point of beating everyone in columns duels until her preferred name for the dog, Hund, is recognized by all. The Wind Division trio are having Ogami help out with their paperwork. In a cute riff on player habits in the original games, Ogami keeps getting interrupted by people he'd also previously promised to help. And the only way the Wind Division are gonna be able to make him stick to his current commitment is to defeat all the interlopers in good old-fashioned columns duels. Yoneda receives Valentine's Day chocolates from an anonymous source. This results in him being convinced that one of the girls in the theater is his secret admirer, which in turn results in no shortage of HR violations. Kayama's signed himself and Ogami up for the theater's talent show, only to find the strings on his guitar have gone missing. It's a race against time to find the strings, or shamelessly beg to borrow replacement ones, before it's time for the big show. Finally, there's Kaede's story, and this one is quite different from the rest. It starts as the alarm blares out and Ogami gets ready to deploy. Something I never really touched upon before is how everyone in the Flower Division gets ready for battle by going down these chutes that magically change them into their uniforms and drop them off in the command center. This time, as Ogami hops into his chute, he conks his head and blacks out. When he awakens, he finds Kaede waiting for him, alone.
Hey, you're finally awake.
She tells him that not only has he been unconscious for 10 hours, he's the only one who even bothered to show up. The two go door to door to each member's room to find out what's up. Everyone's acting strangely, as though their worst tendencies had been amplified, resulting in them shirking their duties. Ogami quickly realizes this is obviously just a nightmare, but try as he might, he can't wake up. This sort of nightmare episode is yet another well-worn cartoon trope, but something about it feels genuinely unsettling here. I think it's mostly because of Kaede herself. As the chapter progresses, she gradually starts acting more cold and authoritarian, threatening the others with court-martialings, and at one point slapping Ogami with zero hesitation. Combine that with the eerie music that plays throughout the entire story and it actually becomes kind of uncomfortable. The columns duels wind up being the moments of levity that break up the tension instead of the other way around, which makes this story a neat, if bizarre, change of pace. Despite being a robust package and having online functionality that was still quite novel for its time, Hanagumi Taisen Columns 2 didn't quite make the splash its predecessor did. While it did sell over 25,000 copies in its first week of release, a normally respectable number, it was buried by post-holiday sales of higher-profile games such as Space Channel 5 and Virtualon Auditorio Tangram, as well as the release of Sega's own marquee juggernaut for the system, Shenmue, just a few days earlier. It ultimately failed to crack the Dreamcast top 10 in its first week, and though it managed 6th place in the following week, it quietly dropped off soon thereafter. Following Hanagumi Taisen Columns 2, there were no more column spin-offs released on consoles. The only other entries in this subseries were applets included as a part of the Sakura Keitai Club service on Japanese mobile phones in the mid-aughts. Oh yeah, and get ready to hear me bring up Keitai Club a lot once we reach the PS2 era. The service saw Hanagumi Columns in 2004, Paris Hanagumi Columns in 2005, and New York Hoshigumi Columns in 2006. You'll notice the Taisen part is cut out because these versions didn't have versus play, likely due to the extremely limited screen real estate. Unfortunately, despite all my searches, I haven't managed to find dumps of any of these games or the Keitai Club app. Unless some valiant soul uploads the files online, these may very well be lost media. If I'm wrong though, and there totally are playable dumps out there, then fucking come on, hook a guy up. After the Keitai Club minigames, there was nothing. No more Column spin-offs whatsoever. There was a 6-player online PC version of Hanagumi Taisen Columns 2 announced for China in 2006, but it never actually made it to release, and there's been no other game in the sub-series since. The Sakura Wars series has only relatively recently been pulled out of mothballs, and the video game market has changed a lot since 2006. Even more so since 2000. What's more, Columns is no longer Sega's premier puzzle game series. Ever since Sega bought the rights to the Puyo Puyo series from its original developer, Compile, in 1998, it's gradually eclipsed Columns in importance. While Puyo Puyo gets new entries on a regular basis, Columns these days gets relegated to retro re-releases of the first 3 games. Hell, Puyo Puyo even ate Columns' lunch when it comes to the Sakura Wars franchise, as characters from both the classic series and the soft reboot have since appeared in the Puyo Puyo Quest mobile game. It's unlikely we'll ever get a new Sakura Wars Columns, not even one based on the new crew. It's a damn shame too, because there's so much to love about these games. They're great takes on an old puzzle classic, managing to add a variety of fresh new mechanics without compromising the feel or identity of the core Columns gameplay, and they still feel great over 20 years later. The story modes too are great representations of the Sakura Wars series' core strength, its characters. It's great to see them interact in these low-stakes situations more, be they relatively grounded scenarios like in Hanagumi Taisen Columns 1, or outlandish hijinks like in Hanagumi Taisen Columns 2. These are priceless supplementary materials for series fans, and engaging puzzle games for non-fans, with mechanics that let them stand on their own. It'd be a wasted opportunity for Sega not to at least re-release these two in the future someday. If nothing else, we at least have fan translations to tide us over in the meantime, such as the one for the other all-original Sakura Project 2000 title, Sakura Wars GB, a game I've become quite familiar with.